Welcome back, everyone, and today we pause to honor some of the American icons we've said goodbye to recently, alongside other cherished figures whose lives left a mark on people far and wide. If this means something to you, a like goes a long way. It helps us keep doing this work with the dignity and thoughtfulness these people deserve. We're glad you're here. Now let's take a moment to honor their memory. Katherine O'Hara has left us at the age of 71. An actress, a comedian, a voice that carried something strangely intimate, the kind you recognized before you could even name where you'd heard it. The announcement came softly, without fanfare, the way certain news tends to arrive when it carries real weight. For many people, it stopped them mid-thought. The kind of moment that makes you realize someone has quietly been woven into the fabric of your life for longer than you knew. For anyone who spent time in front of a television during the late 70s or early 80s, her face was already familiar. There was that wonderfully odd, brilliantly unpolished little show that never tried to be anything it wasn't. It simply worked. And she worked within it effortlessly. Quick-witted, surprising, never performing for the sake of it, just present and doing something that felt genuinely alive. And then, years later, Home Alone brought her to a whole new generation. Kate McAllister sprinting through airport terminals, desperately calling out for her son, carrying a kind of frantic energy that felt strangely grounded for a Christmas comedy. That moment didn't fade because it was big. It stayed because it felt real. Those who shared sets with her tend to say the same things. She was attentive. Unhurried. Away from the cameras, she built a quiet life, a long marriage, a family raised without spectacle. That kind of choice reveals character more honestly than any trophy ever could. And there were plenty of trophies. But that always seemed beside the point with her. It's one of the stranger things about people who become part of your life through a screen. They move through different chapters with you, different homes, different versions of yourself, and you don't always notice until the day they're no longer there. Even then, in the ways that truly count, they don't completely leave. Davey Lopes passed away at 80. For years he was a constant in the world of baseball, both as a player and later as a coach, a second baseman who rarely sought the spotlight but somehow found himself at the center of moments the game hasn't forgotten. Word came from his hometown in Rhode Island, low-key and understated, which felt right somehow. If you followed baseball through the 70s and into the early 80s, particularly the Los Angeles Dodgers, his name needed no introduction. He wasn't the type to demand attention. He was the type you could count on, day after day, through a full season without a single wasted movement or unnecessary gesture. Managers leaned on him the way you lean on something you know won't give way. There's a particular feeling that comes with thinking about baseball from that period. Summer evenings that seemed to stretch on forever, the ambient hum of a stadium crowd, Vin Scully's voice painting pictures over the radio, and Lopez at second base, turning a double play with the kind of calm precision that looked almost effortless. He was a base stealer, too, and a smart one. It wasn't about showing off. It was about reading the moment and acting before anyone else caught up. The pitcher always sensed it coming. After his playing days ended, he stayed close to the game, taking on a coaching role, investing in the next generation. That kind of continuity matters more than statistics ever will. People who knew him describe a man who kept his feet on the ground, who never let the game inflate his sense of importance. And that's exactly why losing him feels significant. Baseball from that era was built on men with that kind of character, and with every passing, there are fewer left who remember what that looked and felt like. Robert Duvall has passed away at 95. He belonged to that rare category of performer where the craft becomes invisible entirely. He didn't appear to be acting. He simply existed within whatever world he inhabited on screen. The news arrived without ceremony, no dramatic build-up, just a quiet acknowledgement that someone who had occupied space in our cultural lives for decades was no longer here. Those who remember the early 70s remember The Godfather, and within it, the particular stillness of Tom Hagen. Not the explosive scenes, not the violence, but the man seated at the table who never needed to raise his voice to command the room. That restraint was Duvall's signature. He never reached for attention because he didn't need to. Then came Apocalypse Now, an entirely different world, and yet he inhabited it just as completely. That now legendary line about the smell of napalm, in the hands of a lesser actor it would have tipped into absurdity. With Duvall, it felt disturbingly sincere, like overhearing something not meant for you. He carried that quality across decades. Lonesome Dove. Tender Mercies. Roles that didn't announce themselves but burrowed in quietly and refused to leave. Everyone who worked alongside him seems to tell the same story. No ego on set. Prepared, present, and generous enough to step back and let a scene find its own breathing room. That discipline is increasingly rare and almost never celebrated the way it should be. In his personal life, he found love later, kept things close and private, never traded his dignity for publicity even when the opportunity was right there. 7 nominations for the Academy Award. 1 win. A career full of recognition. And yet none of that feels like the thing you hold on to. What you hold on to is the feeling of watching him, that sense that something true was happening in front of you. There's a version of Mick Jagger that the world thinks it knows. The swagger, the stages, the image that became as iconic as the music itself. But before any of that existed, there was simply a restless young man in Dartford who hadn't yet figured out what he was meant to do with his life. His father was an educator, methodical and principled, someone who believed in structure and in futures that followed a sensible pattern. His mother perceived something in her son that didn't fit neatly into that framework. Not troublemaking energy, not rebellion exactly, just a kind of internal momentum that had nowhere obvious to go. Mick was a decent student. Disciplined enough, in fact, that in the early 1960s he earned a place at the London School of Economics, which could have pointed his entire life in a very different direction. But music had already begun pulling at something in him, quietly at first and then with increasing force. And then in 1961, something seemingly insignificant shifted everything. A chance encounter on a train platform with Keith Richards, a familiar face from school he hadn't crossed paths with in years. The conversation turned to records, to American blues, to Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry. Nothing about it felt momentous in the moment. Just 2 young men talking about music they loved. But in hindsight, it was the thread that unraveled everything that had come before and began stitching together something entirely new. What Mick had wasn't only ambition. It was an appetite, not yet for fame, just for something larger and less predictable than the life already being mapped out for him. The transformation wasn't sudden. There was no single performance or single night that turned him into the figure people would eventually recognize from a single silhouette. The early days of the Rolling Stones in 1962 were uncertain, unglamorous, played out in cramped venues to audiences who weren't always paying attention. And Mick's voice didn't conform to anything expected of it. It was unrefined, unconventional, bending around words rather than through them. Sometimes it sounded almost deliberate in its looseness. But there was a pulse underneath it, something that felt genuinely alive rather than rehearsed. People were divided. Some found it too affected. Others found it not committed enough. But when he was on a stage, something changed. His body moved on its own terms, not trained choreography but something closer to instinct, a physical language that had nothing to do with what anyone had taught him. Audiences gradually stopped questioning it and started surrendering to it. By 1964, when It's All Over Now reached the top of the UK charts, the trajectory was undeniable. Something was building that went beyond chart positions. But with that growing recognition came a pressure, external and relentless. Managers, journalists, audiences all began projecting onto him, wanting him to embody something specific. Wild. Threatening. Untamable. Some of it was true. But only some. Behind the sharpening image, Mick was still navigating, still making decisions and occasionally missteps, still working out which parts of himself were authentic and which parts had been handed to him by an audience that needed him to be a particular thing. Fame arrived not as a reward but as a force, and it demanded he reckon with who he actually was underneath everything it was building around him. By the close of the 1960s, the shift was total and it hadn't come in stages. Mick Jagger had crossed over from musician to cultural symbol, representing something people couldn't name precisely but felt powerfully. That level of projection carries a cost. In 1967, a drug arrest pulled his private life into public courtrooms and screaming headlines that weren't interested in nuance. The music had become only part of the story. Then 1969 brought Altamont, a free concert that was supposed to feel like a culmination and instead became a tragedy. A young man died that night. The circumstances were complicated and Mick bore no direct responsibility, but the weight of it settled on him regardless. Anyone watching him closely in the years that followed could sense it beneath the confidence, beneath the commanding stage presence, a quieter awareness that had taken up permanent residence. The price of that scale of fame was now something he understood not abstractly but personally. And there were other losses along the way, people who drifted out of his orbit for various reasons. He kept going because the alternative wasn't really available to him anymore. He toured, recorded, adapted. But there are private moments that no documentary captures, the ones where the crowd noise is gone and you're alone with the full accounting of what everything has cost. What time did to Mick Jagger confounded expectations. Rather than diminishing him, it seemed to clarify something essential. In 2021, the death of Charlie Watts took something irreplaceable. Decades of shared musical instinct, a rhythm section that had become almost telepathic, suddenly reduced to memory. And in 2019, a heart condition forced him off the road for a period, something that must have felt profoundly disorienting for someone whose entire adult life had been defined by forward motion. But he returned. Not with a grand declaration, not making it into a narrative about triumph. He simply came back and kept going. And for those who have followed him across the decades, that's the thing that resonates now more than the energy or the spectacle. It's the persistence. It's showing up again. He's well into his 80s, still walking out onto stages where the lights fall on him the same way they always have, but carrying a different meaning now. Less a conquest, more an act of gratitude. For the people who grew up with this music, who measured parts of their own lives against it, there is something deeply reassuring about his continued presence. He's not the restless young man from Dartford anymore, and he makes no attempt to pretend otherwise. And perhaps that's the most honest thing about him now. Some lives aren't defined by what they once were. They're defined by the quiet determination to keep moving forward regardless.